Yes, that's working. Good afternoon. I've got a PowerPoint this afternoon just to support some of the things I'm going to say. And I'm going to speak on a subject that I've never heard spoken in church before. It's a subject that British people like talking about a lot. So I better watch the time. But it is of interest to people all around the world because we all experience it. It's already been mentioned in services today in the guest thought for the week. And British people, when they meet each other, they often greet each other and then ask how they are. And then they get on to this particular subject. So you're probably with me already. It's the weather. And it's quite a coincidence, really, that the guest thought for the week included quite a bit about weather. But this afternoon I'd like to look at some of the scriptures that refer to weather in the Bible, because there's quite a bit of weather in the Bible as well, and look at it in more detail than we would probably do if we were just reading through that passage on its own. So we're picking bits from different parts of the Bible. And I've sort of got four areas that we'll cover. The first area is who created the weather. Second area is who can control the weather. And again, we've heard a little bit about that already. And then we'll move into weather forecasting in the Bible, another subject that follows on from the weather when British people are talking to each other, what's going to happen next. And then some lessons that we can learn from weather. So let's first of all turn to the book of Job and remember that God created the weather. In Job chapter 28, and starting in verse 20, just putting it in context, because not all this is about the weather, but just putting it in context, this is Job speaking to his friends, and he said, "From whence then does wisdom come? And where is the place of understanding? It is hidden from the eyes of all living, and concealed from the birds of the air. Destruction and death say, we have heard a report about it with our eyes. God understands its ways, and he knows its place. For he looks to the ends of the earth and sees the whole heavens, to establish a weight for the winds, and mete out the waters by measure, the rain. When he made a law for the rain." So everything was created by God. "And a path for the thunderbolt. Then he saw wisdom and declared it. He prepared it. Indeed, he searched it out. And to man he said, Behold, the fear of the Lord that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding." So in that section there we see reference to the weight of the wind. Not too strong, not too weak, but wind is necessary. If we turn on to Job 38 and verse 28, again, more about the weather. And this is God speaking to Job, and he asks Job several rhetorical questions. So Job knows knows what the answer is. It's God all the time. And in verse 28, he starts, or just going into the context here, has the rain a father? And the answer is yes, and it's God. Or who has begotten the drops of dew? God's reminding Job, or showing him the power of his creative ability. From whose womb comes the ice? And the frost of heaven, who gives it birth? The waters harden like stone, and the surface of the deep is frozen. I mean, that in its own is such a wonderful creation, because most liquids, when they solidify, they get denser and denser and denser and solidify from the bottom up. But no, the waters harden like stone, and the surface of the deep is frozen. water has this unique ability when it gets cold and the weather gets really cold and ice is formed. Ice is lighter than water and floats, so that all living things in the lakes, in the seas that freeze up, can still live. What a fantastic creator we have. To think of all those things as he was creating the weather. Let's turn on to Ecclesiastes. Just keep your finger in Job if you haven't taken it out already. We'll be coming back to Job. And turn to the book of Ecclesiastes. And Solomon recognised the way God had set up the overall weather system. Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 5. The sun also rises, and the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it arose. The wind goes towards the south, and turns around to the north. So if you're standing in one particular place, you feel a wind coming from one direction, and then, a few hours later, it might be coming from a completely opposite direction. And we all know that it doesn't just go one way and come straight back again. It swirls around, doesn't it? And you're probably familiar with these sort of charts we see on the TV from time to time. Well, quite often really, with low and high pressures and the strong winds, and you can see they circulate around. Why am I showing you that? Well, the next verse, and turns around. The wind whirls around continually and comes again on its circuit. So Solomon recognised this, and God created it like that. The sun coming up and the sun going down, heating the air and cooling it at night, and the world going round, the globe going round, the earth rotating, causes these winds to swirl around. And comes again on its circuit. And the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Incredible, isn't it? To the place from which the rivers come, there they return again. And we know what happens, don't we? Solomon recognised that as well. He knew what happened. And I remember when I was very young at school being taught about this, and we were taught it was the water cycle. And you probably remember drawings like that. And I looked it up on the internet to see if they were still teaching primary school children between 7 and 11. And yes, in Key Stage 2, as it is in this country, that's what they're taught, the water cycle. They're not taught that God created this, but we know that God created this water cycle where we've got the winds moving the clouds around. When the conditions are right, it rains. The water runs off in various ways off the land into the sea and evaporates up into the cloud again. Just as Solomon said, the rivers go back to where they come from, the clouds. And this is so important, I seem to remember being taught it again in secondary school. Only then it was in, I think, the physics lesson, and it was a little bit more technical. Same sort of drawing, but a bit more detail. And it wasn't called water vapour, it was evaporation, and the clouds were transportation because they moved all this water in vapour form to an area where it would precipitate. And it wasn't just rain, it was snow and ice and all sorts of things. And the runoff was not just surface water. We learnt about the aquifers under the ground and how that seeps through the land and then out to the sea. But eventually it ends up in the sea and evaporates again. So this continual cycle. And as I say, Solomon understood it all those years ago. Now, if God created this weather system that continually operates around the world, you'd think he'd be able to control it, wouldn't you? At his will, if he wanted to change it at all. He set everything in motion, but he can control it as well. I hope you kept your finger in Job, because Job 38, we'll now look at verse 32. And again, this section here is where God is speaking to Job and asking him rhetorical questions. Have you entered the treasury of snow, or have you seen the treasury of hail? A treasury is where things come from. So although we might think of snow on the mountains, the treasury is up in the clouds. That's where the hail is before it comes down, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war. By what way is light diffused, or the east winds scattered over the earth? Who has divided a channel for the overflowing water, or the path for the thunderbolt, to cause it to rain on a land where there is no one? A wilderness in which there is no man, to satisfy the desolate waste, and to cause to spring forth the growth of tender grass. Now we take water for granted, don't we? But in some areas of the world, there's very little rainfall. And one of the driest areas in the world is the Atacama Desert in Chile. That doesn't look like a desert, does it? But this year they had tremendous rains in March and further rains in August, and that was the result. And that's just as it says here: rain on a land where there is no one, a wilderness in which there is no man, nobody lives there. And yet God remembers those places, and at times they have marvellous colourful things like that, pink mallow plants and lots of butterflies to go with it. All down to the weather, God controlling the weather. So God is in overall control. And in verse 34, continuing on with these rhetorical questions, can you lift your voice to the clouds, that an abundance of water may cover you? Can you send out lightnings, that they may go and say to you, here we are? Who has put wisdom in the mind, or who has given understanding to the heart? Who can number the clouds by wisdom? Or who can pour out the bottles of heaven? What a picture. Bottles of heaven. It feels like that sometimes, doesn't it? When the dust hardens in clumps and the clods cling together. So yes, God created all this. Of course he can control it. Let's look at one example in the Old Testament. 1 Samuel chapter 12. 1 Samuel chapter 12. First Samuel chapter 12 and in verse 13. And this is Samuel's address to the nation of Israel after they had chosen a king to rule over them. And in verse 13 we read, "Now therefore, here is the king whom you have chosen and whom you have desired. And take note, the Lord has set a king over you. If you fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice and do not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then both you and the king who reigns over you will continue following the Lord your God. However, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you, as it was against your fathers. Now therefore, stand and see this great thing which the Lord will do before your eyes. Is today not the wheat harvest?" Now we know wheat harvest, you want the finest weather you can get, the driest weather. You don't want the crops spoiled, you want the spring rain so the plants grow, and then you want the sun for it to ripen, lovely dry weather to go out and harvest it. "And is today not the wheat harvest? I will call to the Lord, and he will send thunder and rain." Something you really don't want as a farmer when you're waiting to do the harvest. "That you may perceive and see your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of the Lord, in asking a king for yourselves." So they'd already sinned by asking for a king, and God was just going to show them the power that he has to control the weather. They needed to depend on God. So Samuel called to the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day, And all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. So God used his power to show that he could control the weather. He can do what he says. Now in the New Testament, again we had a reference to this in the guest thought for the day, Jesus Christ calming the raging sea. So if we turn to the book of Mark, and in chapter 4, we can just read about this. Mark 4. And in verse 35, Mark 4 and verse 35. On the same day, when the evening had come, he said to them, "Let us cross over to the other side." And this is the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Now when they had left the multitude, they took him along in the boat as he was, and other little boats were also with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that it was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. And they awoke him and said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Now often we've probably read that hundreds of times. But let's just stop and think about this. It was a great windstorm. These men weren't sort of city slickers or town dwellers that had just gone out in a boat for the day and it had just got a bit rough. They knew the Sea of Galilee. They'd worked on it all their lives, or around the coast. They knew these storms could come up. This says, and a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat the boat. It was already filling. The boat was going down. But he was still asleep in the stern. Amazing. So, these fishermen arose and woke him up, and he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" And they feared exceedingly, just like in the Old Testament, the Israelites fearing God when he sent that rain and the thunder in the harvest. They feared exceedingly because they said, "Who can this be? Even the wind and the sea obey him." Now King Canute thought he could do this, but he found that he couldn't, could he? Tried to stop the sea coming up the coast of England back in history, and realised that it wasn't going to obey him. And yet Jesus Christ, no problems. So God controlled the weather he wanted to in ancient times, but what about more recent times? Now we've heard in the past about particular events, and I remember a sermon not that long ago which reminded us of the Battle of Dunkirk and how so many British people were rescued because the weather was better than they thought it was going to be, and people recognised it was a miracle. Just wonder nowadays what would happen if that happened, and God did have mercy on people. Would they give thanks as they did in those days? Anyway, that's getting off the point. But the thing was, the weather forecasters at that time got it wrong. They didn't expect the fog to come down and it to be so still so they could rescue so many people. So man is always interested in weather forecasting. Oh, man can't get it right all the time. Maybe it's just they're not experienced enough. There's too many factors going on. Maybe it's because God's controlling it at that particular time. So, what about weather forecasting in the Bible? Now, you're probably ahead of me now, but if we turn to Matthew chapter 16, and in verse 1, we read, "Then the Pharisees and the Sadducees came and, testing him, asked that he would show them a sign from heaven. He answered and said to them, 'When it's evening, you say, it'll be fair weather, for the sky is red. And it's not a particularly red sky, but I took that earlier in the summer, and that was a reasonably red sky at night, and the next day was very good. So, yes, red sky at night, and the following day, okay. It will be fair weather. But in the morning, if there's a red sky in the morning, it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening. And that actually was last Saturday morning, which was just before Storm Desmond came through. Now, we got away with it very lightly down here. We know the consequences, we've heard about it already, about the floods in Cumbria, but it was still not that pleasant that day. And so that's true as well, isn't it? For the sky is red and threatening. Hypocrites, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the sign of the times. Now, once again, when I was a young lad, I remember being disappointed when there was a red sky at night, but the following day was not very pleasant. I remember saying to my dad, but you told me in the Bible it said, red sky at night, shepherd's delight, red sky in the morning, shepherd's warning, and the Bible's always right. So, when I got older, I learnt a couple of things here. Firstly, the Bible doesn't actually say that shepherds are delighted about a red sky at night, or that they're disappointed to see a red sky in the morning. But secondly, and more importantly, this isn't a statement from God. God's not saying it as a guarantee. He's not giving a guarantee. There's only one thing that's guaranteed in, as far as I can find, in a sign in the sky and the weather, and that's back in Genesis. Keep your finger in Matthew because we're going back there, but in Genesis 9, and verse 12, and this is after Noah's deliverance out of the ark. And in chapter 9, verse 12, God said, "This is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I will set my rainbow in the cloud." Sort of like that. Rather good rainbow. Some people might recognise the location. And continuing, verse 13, "I will set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. It shall be, when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the rainbow shall be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. The waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. The rainbow shall be in the cloud, and I will look on it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." So that is a guarantee. And every time we see a rainbow, maybe not as clearly as that one, we can be reminded that God is in control, that it's never going to be a complete flood around the world again. So going back to Matthew then, I said that's not a guarantee. So let's note exactly what Jesus said. Matthew 16, verse 1. "Then the Pharisees and Sadducees came and testing him asked that he would show them a sign from heaven. He answered and said to them, 'When it is evening, you say,'" not he said. He didn't say they were wrong, by the way, but it was their saying. They'd worked this out. It was their weather forecasting, not God's. "When you say," where am I? When it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening. So he's throwing it back to them. Then he's saying, hypocrites, you know how to discern the face of the sky. So he was saying, yeah, you know, that's a fairly good sign, but not guaranteed. But you cannot discern the signs of the times. So that's exactly what he said. So we shouldn't perhaps have the expression red sky at night, shepherd's delight. Maybe we should say red sky at night, Pharisees and Sadducees' delight. But I think that's a mouthful, so I don't think they'll actually catch on. But having observed it, having seen it, having read it in the Bible, is there any scientific evidence, any scientific facts that back up this? You know, is it guaranteed? You know, is it something that's just an old wives' tale that just happens? Or with the knowledge that we have now, is it something scientific? So the best place to look is the official UK Weather Service, which is the Met Office, and read what they say. And on their website, under Red Sky at Night, it says, red sky at night, shepherd's delight. Red sky in the morning, shepherd's warning. First appeared in the Bible in the Gospel of Matthew. So we've just read that. It is an old weather saying often used at sunrise and sunset to signify the changing sky and originally known to help the shepherds prepare for the next day's weather. Despite there being global variations in this saying, such as red sky at night, sailors' delight. I didn't know that. Red sky in the morning, sailors' warning. The scientific understanding behind such occurrences remains the same. Why does red sky appear at sunrise and sunset? Sort of a question that a young child might ask, isn't it? And parents not too sure the answer to that one. So the saying is most reliable when the weather systems predominantly come from the west, as they do in the UK. And we know that in this country, it's mainly the west or the southwesterlies that bring the rain. Red sky at night, shepherd's delight, can often be proven true, since the red sky at night means fair weather is generally headed towards you. So at night, sunset, west, so good weather is coming from the prevailing area, the west. A red sky appears when dust and small particles are trapped in the atmosphere by high pressure. And we know that when good weather's coming, the barometer goes up, doesn't it? So it's high pressure. So these dust and small particles are trapped in the atmosphere by this higher pressure. This scatters blue light, leaving only the red light to give the sky its notable appearance. All makes sense, doesn't it? A red sky at sunset means high pressure is moving in from the west. Got to get my directions right, haven't I? Coming in from the west, so therefore the next day will usually be dry and pleasant. Red sky in the morning, shepherd's warning, means a red sky appears due to the high pressure system having moved over. So it's already moved east, meaning the good weather has passed, most likely making way for a wet and windy low pressure system. So it all makes sense, doesn't it? So that last one I showed, we've been through the rainbow, and can we go back that one? That last one of last Saturday morning, the preceding days had been good, so the high pressure had gone over. I was looking east into the sunrise, and that was the high pressure gone, disappearing. Bad weather coming in. So that's the scientific explanation. So they knew it occurred in the Bible. Whether they knew the scientific explanation, I don't know. But it's there. God created all this, so we can weather forecast from the Bible. Now, I said that the prevailing weather systems came from the west in this country. And I could add that it's the same in Israel, because it would have happened there, wouldn't it? Red sky at night, shepherd's delight. But do you want to take my word for that? I mean, you can go home and you look up the weather forecast in Israel if you want, or you can work where it is on the map and work out. But we've got the Bible in front of us today, haven't we? So why don't we turn to Luke chapter 12. We don't need to turn far to find the answer. So I'm saying that we've got this weather system in this country, comes from the west, and for red sky at night to be true, that's a sign to be true elsewhere in the world. It's not the same all over the world because it depends where the prevailing wind comes from. But I'm saying the prevailing weather comes from the west or in that direction in Israel. So Luke chapter 12 and verse 54. Again, it's Christ speaking here. And he said, then he also said to the multitude, when you see a cloud rising out of the west, so this weather system's coming from the west, immediately you say, a shower is coming, and so it is. So there we are, the prevailing weather system in Israel. And what happens there? Oh, and when you see the south wind blow, you say there will be hot weather. Because where's it coming from? The equator. So this shower that comes from the west comes off the Mediterranean, large body of water, and that's where lots of the rain clouds come into Israel. So there we are, in the Bible we can see that the situation in Israel, as far as the weather prevailing patterns are concerned, similar to this country. Now rain, as we saw in the first part of the sermon, comes from clouds, comes from the sea, comes from rivers, comes from rain, comes from clouds. So rain comes from clouds. And clouds are a very, very important part of the weather system. And there's some lessons we can learn from clouds and weathers. And I remember, again, as a young person, not quite as young as when I was learning about the weather, but when I was at college, I used to revise for exams. I used to do sort of this trick of 50 minutes in an hour and then 10 minutes let your mind go and think of other things. And for summer exams, it's nice fine weather, and I used to lay out in the parents' garden, sunning myself at the same time as doing my studies. And they used to live about 2 miles from the coast of Bournemouth Bay. And as I had a break in the revision, so I'd do my 50 minutes or so, maybe 45 minutes, and then think about something else. And I'd look up and I'd notice that sometimes the clouds would sort of drift across the sky, and then at a certain point they seemed to just thin out and vanish. And over the days of doing this, I must have thought I was out there all the time looking at the clouds, I noticed it was always the same place in the sky. It just disappeared. And one day there were more clouds than usual. I don't know what I was doing out sunbathing, or in the garden, but there were more clouds than usual. And I noticed this distinct curve in the sky, that just a large curve in the sky where there's clouds one side, blue sky the other, and you could see the clouds just disappearing. And I realised that curve was exactly above the edge of the bay. So it was mirroring the coastline. And what was happening was that the reflected heat over the sea was causing the clouds to just evaporate themselves. And I couldn't go back and find any photographs of that time, but earlier in the summer we were down in Lyme Regis. And this is 11 o'clock in the morning, and I hasten to add, or I should have added, that it's in the morning, you get cloud in the morning, and it's as the day warms up, it seems to disappear over the sea. So that's looking inland, and as we panned round, I thought, yes, it's all the cloud is hanging over the land. And there it is, there's the bay. And it's almost a perfect curve just round where the land mass is. So much for holiday snaps. But that's just to illustrate what I'm trying to show you as to what was in my mind all those years ago. And when I began reading and studying the Bible, this memory of this cloud behaviour came into my mind when I read this verse in Hosea. So we'll turn to Hosea. Jonah, Micah, here we are, Hosea chapter 6. Hosea chapter 6 and verse 4. And breaking into the context here, the heading here in my Bible is Impenitence of Israel and Judah. O Ephraim, what shall I do to you? O Judah, what shall I do to you? For your faithfulness is like a morning cloud, and like the early dew, it goes away. And I used to read this and think about, yes, the faithfulness of Ephraim and Judah was just like that morning cloud, that when the day gets a bit hotter and there's a bit of reflected heat, it just disappears, just like morning dew. It's on the grass in the morning, and if you want to cut the grass, it's a good excuse not to do it until later in the day. You don't cut the grass first thing in the morning because there's a dew, but you go at about 11 o'clock, half 11, all disappeared as the day warms up. And that's a lesson for us, because unfortunately some people's faith is just like that of Ephraim and Judah. It starts off being present. It might be very strong, like some of the clouds were quite heavy and thick. But it doesn't last long before it just disappears. Sometimes it just goes with the passage of time. As we say, as the morning goes, it just goes. Other times it's because things heat up a little bit and they lose their faith. So I find this a very useful reminder when pressures come along. Because I think, no, God doesn't want us to be like Ephraim or Judah. God doesn't want us to lose faith, like a cloud just disappearing out of the sky. The first 3 verses of this chapter are also interesting. Hosea 6 verse 1. Come and let us return to the Lord, for he has torn, but he will heal us. He has stricken, but he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. On the 3rd day he will raise us up, that we may live in his sight. Let us know, let us pursue the knowledge of God. His going forth is established as the morning. He will come to us like the rain, like the latter and the former rain, 2 seasons of rain in Israel that gave them the life out of the earth, the fruit that they needed. So rain comes from clouds. Let's just turn back to Ecclesiastes and read some more observations of Solomon. So if we look at Ecclesiastes chapter 11 this time, Ecclesiastes chapter 11 and verse 3. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or the north, in the place where the tree falls, there shall it be. Just that first phrase though, if the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. That's what clouds are for. It's the treasury of the rain. Continuing on verse 4, he who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. So again, the agricultural society had to wait for the right conditions to do certain things, like me waiting for the grass to get rid of the dew in the morning before I attempt to cut it. But clouds are full of rain. That's their purpose. But not all clouds are full of rain. There have been instances where areas of the world have suffered extended areas of drought, and yet there's been significant cloud cover. The clouds just haven't produced the rain. They're there. Scientists have tried cloud seeding. Man's so desperate to get water, they tried what they call cloud seeding. And they seed the clouds with crystals of silver or potassium iodide, which help to create the precipitation that's needed, the conditions in the cloud to get the water out. And America's claimed a number of successes in this field, and China has been practicing this for ages, and the quantity of water they claim to have got out of clouds is about 10 times greater than America has done. Now, a lot of scientists dispute this because how do you know? How do you know it's not going to rain anyway? But nevertheless, they're so desperate they go to this extreme measure of trying to suck the water out of the clouds, because that's what they're for. There's water up there, they want it on the earth. And as I say, China have done this for some time, and there was an extended drought in China some years ago. One area had been dry for like 9 to 10 years with very, very little rainfall. And the Chinese scientists persisted and persisted, and man thinks he knows the best. They think they know how to do things. And they kept up doing this so persistently that they didn't take consideration of the changes in the atmospheric condition. They didn't do their weather forecasting properly. And what happened, they didn't produce the required result. Due to an unexpected cold air at high altitude, the contents of the clouds didn't produce rain, it came down as snow. And literally in that part of China, which had been dry for years, there were these amazing pictures of beautiful Chinese buildings with thick snow on, and poor Chinese men trying to cycle bikes through this heavy snow after years of having little rain. But my point is, clouds are meant to give rain. That's their purpose. That's what they're there for. A man will do anything to get that out. But you know, in the Epistle of Jude, and you might be there already, there's one verse that's very interesting in relationship to clouds and the dryness. So if we turn to Jude now. And Jude is talking about the false teachers, the false ministers in the church. And in verse 12 he says, "These are spots in your love feasts, while they feast with you without fear, serving only themselves." So these false teachers were serving themselves. They weren't thinking of the people. They weren't being generous. They weren't teaching God's ways to them properly. So what were they? They are clouds without water, carried about by the winds. They are late autumn trees without fruit, twice dead, pulled up by the roots. But yes, so they're clouds without water. They weren't doing their purpose. They weren't teaching God's ways. They weren't giving the rain, the water that we were hearing about earlier on. So these false teachers were unproductive, not useful. Clouds are meant to provide rain, and trees are meant to produce fruit, but these teachers just didn't do that. God wants his teaching to be productive, to produce fruit. Fruit needs water from the rain. Let's turn to Deuteronomy 31. Deuteronomy 31. Just keep an eye on the clock because, as I said, British people can talk about the weather for days and days. Right, in Deuteronomy 31 and verse 19, just breaking into the context here, and it's God speaking to Moses here. And he says, now therefore, write down this song for yourselves and teach it to the children of Israel. Put it in their mouths, that this song may be a witness for me against the children of Israel. So God was giving Moses this song. And if we drop down to verse 30, we can see what the song says. Then Moses spoke in the hearing of all the congregation of Israel the words of this song until they were ended. And Deuteronomy chapter 32, there's no chapter break as we know, so just reading it straight through. Give ear, O heavens, and I will speak, and hear, O earth, the words of my mouth. Let my teaching drop as rain, or as some translations have it, let my doctrine drop as rain, my speech distill as the dew, and raindrops on the tender herb. And we've seen what rain does to dry lands. Just think what it does to the tender herbs. And as showers on the grass. So God's using an analogy here of the weather systems again, showing that that's how we're taught. That's how he wants the word to go forth. So it's spreading. We are soaking in the water of God's word. False teachers don't do that. No wonder Jude likens them to clouds without water. Now, another lesson we can learn from the weather is that God will do what he says. We've seen examples of that already. But he will do what he says. He will fulfill his plan for mankind. And in Isaiah 55, we can see this, and again, another link to weather. Isaiah chapter 55. Isaiah 55 and verse 10. For as the rain comes down and the snow from heaven and does not return there, but water the earth and make it bring forth and bud, that it may give seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth, just like that rain or the snow that comes down from heaven. It shall not return to me void, but it shall accomplish what I please. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, I thought it did return. I thought it all went round in a circle. But it says, it will not return to me void. When rain comes and lands on the ground, it does something before it goes back up. It produces fruit. It gets plants to grow. That's what God's saying here. It won't return to him without having done a purpose. It shall accomplish what I please, and it will prosper in the thing which I sent it. For you shall go out with joy and be led with peace. Now this is a vision of the future. So this is the purpose of God's reign, his word. For you shall go out with joy and be led with peace. The mountains and the hills shall break forth into singing before you, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. Instead of the thorn shall come up the cypress tree. Instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle tree. And that shall be to the Lord for a name, for an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off. So we've seen how clouds, one particular aspect of the weather systems, can be used for good example, or for bad examples, and then good examples. And God uses clouds for important, positive and encouraging examples for us in the Bible. God used a cloud to lead and guide the nation of Israel through the wilderness, coming out of Egypt. Now some might say, well, is that a real rain cloud or is that just a cloud of smoke? Well, I don't know the answer, but nevertheless we're talking about clouds and that's there, but let's continue because it's also a picture of baptism. If we turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and we know this so well, 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verses 1 to 4, we read, Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that our fathers were under the cloud. All passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Now, I don't often make predictions, but with all I've said about clouds today, I'm going to make a prediction. I'm going to say that when Christ returns, it will not be a cloudless day. Rather bold. Well, let's turn to Acts chapter 1. Acts chapter 1. Acts chapter 1, verses 9 to 11. And this is the account of the ascension into heaven. Now, when he had spoken these things, while they watched, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And while they looked steadfastly towards heaven, as he went up, behold, two men stood by them in white apparel, who also said, Man of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will so come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven. So isn't he going to come out of a cloud? And if we turn forward to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, First Thessalonians chapter 4 and verses 17 and 18. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds. So clouds there. To meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore comfort one another with these words. So overall, we have a negative feeling about clouds. We much prefer a sunny day, I'm sure. And when we see clouds, oh, it's going to rain again. And as Mr. Robinson said last week, we mustn't complain. But aren't these clouds that we're going to go up into something worth looking forward to? What a weather pattern to look forward to. What a picture that God's given us. That he's created the weather system, that we have this blessing of sunshine to ripen the crops, to ripen the foods that we have the rain to provide that support of those, the growth of those plants. And we have the rain of his word, the word that can water us and feed us and refresh us every day. And finally, we can look forward to joining Christ in the clouds.